So welcome. It's the first in the EU in times of crisis panels. There's a second one after this. I think it's tomorrow. I'm Louise Wylie. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Manchester, and I'll be chairing today. We have four panelists presenting their research on the EU in times of crisis. They are Alba Prados Pascual from the University of Anglia, Carlos Bravo Laguna from eBay, Pompeu Fabra University, and Niel Mortimer from Loughborough University London, and Piotor Grabara from Universitia di Cagliari. Our panelists are going to present back to back, and then we'll take questions from the audience. I'm sure I'll have lots of questions as well. And we're going to ask Carlos to go first, and he will be presenting to us about analysing an external crisis from a network perspective, the response to cyclones, EJ and Kenneth. So Carlos, if you're happy to go, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis, for your introduction. So yes, I'm Carlos, and this is the third and final paper of my PhD thesis, which is analyzing the response to a humanitarian crisis, namely the cyclones Idai and Kenneth. More specifically, I'm trying to focus on what the role of the European Union, supranational member state bodies involved in the response was. And also I'm trying to have a look at the overall crisis response network and seeing whether certain characteristics of the actors involved made them more likely to interact with one another. So also, basically, this is more focusing on what the European Union is doing. Actually, it's a more hands-on study with, empirical, lots of very rich empirical evidence you're going to see. But of course, it also has this. It's a theory-based study, and this is a sort of a literature gap in the field in the sense that there is not that many of these empirical, theory-based empirical studies on the management of humanitarian crises. So we're here also trying to explore the politicization of EU external relations. Why? We're here analyzing an external crisis. And what is an external crisis? Well, it's an episode that requires an immediate response under conditions of uncertainty. In the particular, this is a concept that is taken from the standpoint of the European Union, from the perspective of the European Union, in the sense that, well, here we see that this is an event located outside of the European Union borders, but still it had enough relevance for the European Union to step forward, step ahead, and coordinate with other non-European Union governments and non-governmental actors. In this particular case, Idai and Kenneth, they were two cyclones that struck Southeast Africa between March and April 2019. It affected several countries: Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Comoros, and resulted in thousands of deaths, millions of individuals in need of assistance, and actually was labeled as perhaps the worst natural disaster ever to strike the Southern Hemisphere by a spokesperson of the World Meteorological Organization. But despite these terrible figures, it hasn't been very salient in European media, and Europeans haven't heard much of it, and it hasn't really been actually. Part of the reason is that it wasn't an immediate threat to the European Union. But this is interesting, right, as well, to have a look at what does the EU when there is a crisis demanding a response, but it's not actually a direct threat. And this is what I'm trying to have a look at. So first of all, regarding the system to manage European external humanitarian emergencies, the EU relies very much on the UN cluster system led by UN OCHA with occasional participation of national governments, which has worked fairly well in the past. But it also, of course, has its own initiatives, such as the Civil Protection Mechanism, which was activated for the response, Rescue, and then, of course, the DG of the European Commission, DG ECHO, which took a very active role in this response. Humanitarian aid is a shared competence in the European Union. So both the member states and the supranational level have competency here, which poses the question whether there will be a lack of coherence in their activities or overlapping, or actually was, they managed to coordinate themselves well. Here, let's go a bit with the literature framework. Basically, the normative power Europe scholars argue that the use of humanitarian aid, among other purposes, is the shaping what is the conceptions of normal in the global scene. What do I mean here? Well, the European Union perceives itself as a champion of multilateralism in the sense that it will tend to interact with, for example, UN bodies, non-governmental organizations in their view, to a greater extent than non-EU governments, which would tend more towards bilateralism. So taking 1, 2, 3 key actors and then channeling their interventions with interactions with them. And on the other hand, they also, in the European Consensus of Humanitarian Aid, this document says that humanitarian actions should be based on principles of neutrality, independence, impartiality, and humanity. So here, it's important to see whether actually this the European Union managed to project itself, at least the values that it proclaims in its own documents and treaties. So first hypothesis that we have in this paper is that actually the European Union member states and supranational actors were more likely to interact with international and non-profit organizations than non-governmental organizations than non-EU governments. But however, this is what stands on paper, but sometimes we know that political and security considerations also matter here. Actually, the role of member states ends up being more of an enlightened self-interest in order to minimize damages. The sooner and more effectively we intervene, the less we will have to spend later on. Actually, there is a very high importance of bilateral post-colonial relations. For example, Mozambique could be the case of Portugal, as it was a former Portuguese colony. And even internally, humanitarian interventions have been heavily contested. So, partly as a result of this, in the past, the literature says that even though the European Commission is formally empowered to handle humanitarian operations, it hasn't really become a very active node in this type of intervention. So second hypothesis based on this field of theory is that the member states actually ended up being more central, more relevant in the crisis network than the European Commission in this particular case. Now, more theory. Resource dependency theory basically tries to make sense of, for example, a humanitarian response. And among other things, it says that actors will have different behaviors depending on their dependence on particular resources. In the specific case of humanitarian intervention, money will be a key resource. So we can separate here actors between donors. Most of them were governments that gave money to tackle the response, and then organizations that would be potential money recipients that would implement actions on the ground. So we could maybe have a look as to whether these two types of organizations were behaving in a different way. For example, governmental donors, the theory would say that they would attract attention because they do have the money, so actually recipient would seek to contact them. So in this particular case, we are here hypothesizing that the governmental donors in the network tended to have more in-degree values than money recipients. What is an in-degree value? Basically, that lots of actors said we were in contact with donor governments. And if you have later questions, I can elaborate as to why in-degree and out-degree, namely sending out or reporting I am in touch with someone else, matters, this distinction. But we can talk about later on. Here. Also, however, this impulse for especially money recipients to cooperate with, in this case, good donor governments had to be balanced with their need to preserve their autonomy, right? Their ability to take their own decisions and not be conditioned. If, among other things, resource dependency theory says that if you have several suppliers of a particular resource, you become less dependent on a single one. So therefore, you have greater agency in this particular response. So here we are also hypothesizing that money recipients would tend to to send out more ties. So say I am in touch with more actors than donor actors, right? In order to reduce this dependency. The final hypothesis that we have here is that according to this distinction, donor-recipient, donors will want to intervene with recipients, will have an incentive because they want to, their money to be spent in an effective way, and will have less of an incentive to interact with other donors. And same goes for money recipients. Money recipients might have a greater incentive to interact with the organization that actually have the money that they can receive, rather than with other money recipients. This is according at least to resource dependency theory. So the hypothesis would be that donors will tend to interact with recipients and less so with donors, and recipients, same goes for recipients, more likelihood to interact with donors and less so with also recipients. So what is the methodology that I'm using here? I'm sorry, I'm going so fast. Social network analysis and interviews as well, of course. What is a social network analysis? Well, it's basically a relational perspective. Rather than laying emphasis on actors themselves, on organizations themselves that participated in the response, we're here focusing on their interactions. So who they were in touch with, also the system of interactions, the overall structure that contains them. This is quite useful to see. Well, first of all, it provides really, really rich empirical information. Also capturing interactions not only formally, that can be accessed, for example, in minutes of meetings, but also at the informal level. This is quite important in crises. For example, when you need to talk, through emails or email exchanges, phone calls, it's harder to trace if you have a look at documents, but it's not if you end up using, for example, this methodology, the way I use it at least. Also, it allows, for example, the capturing hierarchical dynamics. This that I'm saying, if you send a tie to someone, but that someone doesn't say that it has sent a tie to you, it's likely that you were in touch with each other, but the other person is less likely to remember you because it might be in a higher end of hierarchy. So this means we can also see who was more in a higher end of the hierarchical chain here. And without getting too technical, I'm using a quantitative technique called ERGMs, exponential random graph models, which is basically trying to examine what the likelihood is of observing the network that you have here out of the amount of possible ranges of networks with the same node and ties. I don't want to get too technical, but the reason, for example, why you cannot use regression analysis here is that observations are dependent on one another, and therefore you cannot really use regression, which assumes independence of observations. We can actually have a look at endogenous patterns or exogenous patterns behind the creation of ties, where homophily matters, so donor-donor, recipient-recipient, reciprocity, etc. We can get to that later. So I built a network by distributing a survey among individuals involved in this management of this crisis. I asked them who they were in touch with during the crisis, how often, and did they monitor the actions of the organizations that they were in touch with, and how relevant were they. I managed to get 100% of response rate, and this is very good because this methodology is very sensitive to missing data. And also, how did I define the actors that were there? Depending on the amount of money that they donated. I'm focusing here on the response of Mozambique because it's the most affected country, and clearly it was very hard to find people that knew of the response in all countries, so better to focus on one. And also, while they were answering the survey, they could point actors that were missing in the original list, just in case there was any issues. For example, OCHA was clearly not among the biggest donors, but still had a very important role, so it was included. Validity concerns. Of course, we're talking about subjective answers, so I try to target the individuals with the highest executive responsibilities in each organization, so that they would know who their organization was in touch with. And I also had a look at certain documents of reports of the crisis, where I could see, actually this tie happened. Is it in my network? Most of them, they were in my network, so 88.4% in at least one end of the network. This makes makes us quite safe that data have quite high validity, also because of the high reciprocity rate, which is basically if I say I'm in touch with you, did you say I'm in touch with you, you're in touch with me as well? This is an indicator of validity as well, and it's relatively high. And again, the fact that it's not 100% could be explained for example, hierarchical processes, as I told you before. And also some interviews. I know I only have 7. It's a work in progress, so I'm trying to expand this. Okay, so what did I get? Here is the network. I mean, we can see here that the response was relatively smooth and efficient. UN organizations were the most influential here, Mozambique as well. The Commission was actually more central than most European Union governments. I mean, I don't know if you can see it, but EU organizations are with the circle. So member state governments, perhaps Italy was quite relevant, others less so, but they were much more central and relevant than non-EU governments, which have pentagonal shape. So Canada, Japan, even the United States or the United Arab Emirates were less relevant here. And I'm going to finish soon. So the civil protection mechanism was activated actually very smoothly and very efficiently. Now, patterns that we see with the ERGM analysis, actually EU actors were indeed more likely to interact with non-government organizations and international organizations. So actually quite more multilateral response than non-EU governments, which tended to have a more bilateral response. Money recipients tended to be more active actually as well than donors. This is quite counterintuitive related to the hypothesis that we had, but actually the explanation is that they were thus better able to coordinate among themselves, more efficient response. And I'm going to finish very soon. No homophily or heterophily detected between donors and recipients. This is goodness of it, so actually saying that the models actually work. And pretty much that's all I wanted to say. Well, the EU reaction was actually consistent with the normative principles that it's basically arguing, so this is quite interesting, and the Commission was very active and central in this response. To sum up, saying that Mozambique is a very vulnerable country to natural disasters, so it would be great if in the future responses took more into account local actors and made it in a more sustainable manner. Thank you very much. That's all for me.
Thank you very much. Right, I think we'll move on to Niel, if that's okay. We did have Alba briefly, but she seems to be having really bad connection problems. There's been lots of emails being pinged back and forth and trying to figure it out. So Niel, if you wouldn't mind going next, and then we'll have Piotor, and then hopefully Alba will join us at the end. That's all right. I'm going to try and say this, Niel, in one go. Reacting experimentally in times of crisis, a projected study of experimental responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, extending the theory of experimentalist government within and beyond the EU.
Yeah, hello everybody, and welcome to my presentation. My name is Niel Mortimer, and I'm representing the Institute for Diplomacy and International Governance at Loughborough University, London. So in my presentation today, I'll focus on the current progress of my PhD research, which only began in October 2020. So I've only been working on this for about 8 months now. So due to this, and before I begin, I want to express that due to the preliminary nature of this research, various ideas and concepts will be subject to change and or future modification. So as Louise aptly put, my working title is Reacting Experimentally in Times of Crisis, a projected study of experimental responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, extending the theory of experimentalist governance within and beyond the EU. And after hearing that back, I now know it's quite the tongue twister, so I think it will be changed quite a few times until I get to my final title. So in general, I've devised the grounds for a comparative case-orientated approach, comparing and contrasting the UK response to that of the EU, international public organizations such as the WHO, and devolved or federal administrations across Europe. So yeah, moving on to the next slide now. So in a nutshell, this research hopes to provide incremental solutions to ease or escape the current polycrisis that looms over Europe. So the research adopts an outward international approach, highlighting the ways in which governance strategies and policy formulation or learning have varied in the global COVID-19 response. So the polycrisis itself can be understood as a label for the simultaneous existence of multiple crises that have arisen in the past decade. So obviously, in line with the theme of this panel, and to name a few, we include the climate, of which Alba will obviously discuss mitigation and adaptation, Carlos, who've just looked at the devastating effects of cyclones Ida and Kenneth, and also we consider the Brexit and democratic backsliding as crises, of which Piotor will discuss the trade and cooperation agreement, and not failing to mention the Eurozone, migrant, and of course, ongoing COVID-19 crisis, which is of course where my focus lies. So in general, at present, we see that Europe increasingly faces challenges of a global nature, amplifying struggles in the creation of reactive, reflexive, and inclusive policy. These challenges actually require us to rethink and remodel existing governance and policy-making practices. And with the next pandemic more of a question of when, rather than what if, we must use this opportunity to prepare and adapt for the next. So the initial inspiration for this research actually stemmed from the famous quote by one of the founding fathers of the EU, Mr. Jean-Claude Monnet, who exclaimed that Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. So of course, I hope that this research and that of the wider panel can start to lay the foundations for these very solutions. Moving on to the next one. My research begins by introducing alternatives across the governance and policy-making sphere, starting with the new phenomena to experiment. So experimentation is very much in fashion at the minute, at least in the public sphere, as experiments are now taking place almost everywhere, away from the classical settings of laboratories and traditional scientific disciplines. So experimentation in policy offers new solutions to the most complex societal issues and puts those solutions into practice. But of course, if we want many of these small experiments to lead to major structural changes, systematic evaluation and further investigation must take place. So recent demands to experiment in the public sphere have resulted in the emergence of a governance methodology that is featured prominently across a wide range of EU policy domains. The tendency to experiment in policy aids with new approaches and assists with the creation of new ideas and alternative solutions to some of the most complex and challenging societal issues. So this phenomenon that I just mentioned, from experimenting to experimentalist governance, is known as an evolving philosophy, as in academic circles is known as experimentalist governance, of which I'll refer to throughout this presentation as XG. So XG may be referred to as an experimentalist decision-making architecture based on a recursive process of framework goal setting and revision through a comparative review of implementation experiences in diverse local concepts. So as you can see on the slide itself on the left-hand side, these elements can be incorporated into a cyclical nature, where I have jotted down the process as it works in the EU. So take a look at that if you want to see how it works. So in general, the literature on XG has covered both the diffusion and emergence across institutional settings of the EU, which has generated valuable insights about the interaction of different governing modes and EU institutions. So again, the lure to experiment has also led to a change of European governance models, and real-world practices have shown that XG can really assist with incremental solutions, which are considered as stepping stones to problems that are characteristically diverse and uncertain, aka crisis. So even though the extended ideals have replicated in processes across the globe, it is here and beyond the EU's institutional makeup where research stumbles to provide an adequate analysis of experimental policy making. So this is obviously of great interest, as the poly crisis is increasingly salient, and much like Carlos has just touched on, many of these problems do not stop at the borders of the EU itself. So if we're looking at inaction and experimental governance and what's actually happened so far in crisis, careful examination reveals that the Eurozone, migrant, and climate crises have all benefited from experimental evaluations. So the Eurozone itself caused an institutional shake-up of the EU's financial regulatory bodies and developed the foundations for the European semester. So whilst initial findings do not equate the migrant crisis as representative of experimental architectures, the solutions do. So experimentalist solutions have since been tasked with changing the poor perception of migrants towards addressing key limitations surrounding the common European asylum system. So these two very examples express institutional-based change, whereas concerning the climate, a systematic approach has taken hold. So climate change experiments have long reimagined climate-based interventions across social and technical practices. And experimentation has arguably formed a broad agenda to engage with the diversity of climate-based concerns. And this could markedly be seen in the development of the Paris Agreement just a few years ago now. So with this summed up and these crises being touched on in an experimentalist fashion, our focus must now focus on experimentalism and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So limitations are quite obvious here, so policy cycles have not had enough time to evaluate it, and it would be difficult to provide extensive empirical data. However, I'm confident that drawing from the research that has already taken place, we can not only equip ourselves with the skill sets to identify forms of XG, but we can actually investigate practical applications within and beyond the EU. So moving on to my contribution and where my projected output lies, today, as we've summarized, Europe clearly faces a multitude of crises, and this research hopes to explore the potential of XG to provide solutions to these uncertain problems. So I think that through comparing and contrasting national responses to the COVID-19 crisis, this research may be able to tease out modes of experimentation away from modes of authoritarianism and decipher whether the theory of XG is taking place in these contexts, both inside and outside the EU. So in general, and when it comes to the theory, I seek to build on, improve, elaborate, and refine existing XG literature, studying the European-wide departure from hierarchical governance in times of crisis. I also hope to contribute towards a better understanding of the operating logic of crisis, as crisis is now a label for pretty much anything and everything, and I'd like to determine how and when these new forms of governance are to be utilized. So I asked myself, can we reveal and present an experimental toolkit to advance fast-moving and effective policy when it is needed most? So moving on to some methodology here. Obviously, because I'm still only in the early period, this is where things are quite underdeveloped, but as I begin to operationalize my research, I have made some early advances when it comes to methodology, and I've identified some subsequent issues that may arise. So again, this is the area where my research is rather premature, yet I've sketched out the following to start. I'll most likely use a comparative case-based study, examining how XG operates both inside and outside the EU, and I'll detail more on this on the next slide. Secondly, process tracing stands out to be a good method to use. However, there's a worry that it's only possible with crises prior to COVID-19, as of course, COVID-19 policy cycles have still not been revised and even implemented to the sake of were they positive or negative. And with inquiries taking place, it might take some time to be able to give that advice. Thirdly, obviously, high-level interviews will take place with policymakers and officials, most likely virtually, which may actually be a good thing because it might be easier to get more people to talk. But then again, when it comes to inquiries, some people might not want to talk at all. And fourth, obviously with XG theory itself and the utilization of lower level units in the policy cycle, I must work out a way to reach out to these lower level units and hoping to shed light on their understanding of the theory and whether they're even aware of what they're participating in. So moving on to my projected methodology here, which develops some of those earlier thoughts. Since the submission of my paper for this conference, I have made some strides when it comes to my methodology. So even though I'm now gravitating towards a UK-based case study, this is not to say that the European dimension will no longer be relevant. So due to my close proximity and personal connection to the government base, I think that understanding the UK's, of course, rather messy approach will help guide and introduce comparisons within and across the EU. So introducing an international dimension, I think it certainly aids with the selection of comparative cases, whilst finding the gap that this research contribution will fill. So to start off with, I want to compare the UK approach to that of international organisations, determining how and why the UK world-beating narrative took shape, and whether public organisations such as the WHO were listened to, learnt from, or even cooperated with. Secondly, the UK, of course, will be compared to the EU response, hoping to determine whether experimentation was used either on the EU side or on the UK side, and whether learning and collaboration were missing thanks to Brexit. And third and finally, I think the UK response should be contrasted to its devolved administrations, which opens up the debate about experimentalism. So we can pose whether central government utilised an experimentalist approach to test, revise, and review policy on smaller scales before embedding them centrally. And this narrative goes along the line of central government goes it alone, goes rogue, or knows best. So when it comes to these three dimensions of comparative cases, a specific dimension of the COVID response certainly suggests itself as a focus. So number one, when I'm talking about the UK and international organisations, I'm hoping that I can introduce cross-national debates over the role of the state of governance and policy making. So for example, are external organizations listened to? Are they listened to more in the EU or in the UK? And how politically charged are the decisions that are made? And secondly, when it comes to the UK and the EU, we can examine the political economy and perhaps the governance of the vaccine supply. So did Brexit facilitate a better vaccine response to that of the EU? And third and finally, when we're looking at lockdown and testing measures, and we look at the devolved nations and federalist states in the EU, we can refer to lockdown and testing measures, asking, were pilot measures taken? Were experimental approaches used? And when we compare to federalist member states such as Switzerland, it might be a good way to compare what happened there and what happened in the devolved administrations in the UK. So yeah, I guess this concludes my PowerPoint itself, and I hope that you will have enjoyed the contents today. And I'm aware that, of course, at this early stage, many holes persist in my research design, but this is naturally the case at this stage. So many thanks to the audience and UASIS for allowing me to present today, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists today. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's always, interesting because I don't think you ever really feel particularly like you have a huge handle on exactly what you're doing throughout your PhD. I think just getting in there reasonably early can be quite a good thing, and just getting used to presenting and doing all that kind of stuff. And it seems like you've got, probably, in all honesty, compared to me, you've got a pretty good handle on what you're doing for being only a few months in. So let's move on to Piotor, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, and I want to thank all the organizers, everyone organizing this event for this opportunity. My name is Piotor Grabara. I'm a PhD student from the University of Cagliari in Italy, and I will present my paper on Britain's final trade deal with the EU, and in particular about two of the critical issues that were holding back this agreement and the whole Brexit process, which are the fisheries, as nothing could have been finally agreed until there was an agreement on the fisheries, and the question of the Irish border that is continuing to create disruptions and disagreements on its implementation. And the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement finally came through on the 24th December 2020, with the transition period ending only 1 week later. This agreement was immediately announced by both sides, but from different perspectives, focusing on the parts of the deal that were considered a win in the terms of the concluded negotiations and emphasizing achieved objectives promised to keep. The European Union published a clear checklist of differences this deal had in respect of the full EU membership in the key areas of interest. And what struck the eye at the first impact was that it didn't focus on what was included in the trade deal, but on the privileges that were being lost, which was understandable to preserve the union and make sure that no other member state would follow the British example. But in this case, it's also important to report those losses, as this is an unprecedented event in history of trade deal negotiations, where the partners started from the complete level of integration and regulation alignment and ended up keeping only few areas of mutual cooperation. And since 1st January 2021, most of the United Kingdom, except the Northern Ireland, has left the European single market, the customs union. But as long as the rules of origin were confirmed and the proper documentation provided, UK would continue to trade with the EU without tariffs and quotas. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, gave a speech expressing her satisfaction and relief about managing to secure this agreement, and she assured that with this deal there will be a protection for the high quality standards in the trade and respect for the EU regulations, and there will be tools to maintain fair competition between both sides. It will also safeguard the areas of mutual interest, like battling against climate change. And then she mentioned the fisheries. She was glad to announce that with this deal, EU has secured 5.5 years of predictability for the European fishing communities to continue fishing in the British waters, while Boris Johnson, on the other hand, was much more enthusiastic about the benefits he provided for his country with this deal, as he called it, Jumbo Canada-style free trade deal. According to his speech, it was the biggest trade deal his government has completed since officially leaving the EU on the 31st January 2020, worth £660 billion a year. While in reality, that was a value of maintained trade already existing with the EU from the possibility of no-deal Brexit. He claimed the deal would protect jobs and allow goods to be sold without tariffs and quotas, and even more business relations would be possible than before, as instead of the non-tariff barriers, he visioned the opportunity to trade on the same terms with the whole world. Free trade in this sense means there will be no tariffs or limitations on the quantity of the trade, but it doesn't mean there are no other non-tariff barriers. And unfortunately for the British exporters, leaving the European Customs Union means more paperwork and longer delivery time, as border checks will have to be made. Afterwards, Prime Minister emphasized regaining the control of the British law and the end of the European Court of Justice jurisdiction with this deal, which would allow setting their own standards and freely innovate. Finally, delivering on his campaign promises, Boris Johnson declared that after a reasonable period of 5.5 years, Great Britain will be again an independent coastal state with full control of its. And that was the key point of his speech, which confirms the main issue ultimately holding back any progress for both sides of the negotiations were always the fisheries. This relatively small industry became symbolic in the Brexit process as one specific area of interest that was blocking the entire agreement worth 1,000 times more. It was never an economic issue, but a political question of sovereignty and optics to appear the winning side in the negotiations. But why this particular industry? Well, in July 2018, a report found that European vessels were fishing over 8 times more of British fish than UK was getting from the European waters. The balance naturally seemed unfair, and regaining control of the British fish became a principle. As part of the EU, UK had the right to 50% of the fishing quotas inside their coastal waters, while the rest of the EU members shared the 33% of those quotas, but they were still managing to catch triple. This is, though, up to the British government to distribute their rights to fishing quotas among all the fishermen. And for example, in just one deal, the government sold 25% of their quotas to a single Dutch company called Interfish. As for the agreed changes by the TCA, UK and the EU compromised on gradually reducing the access to the British waters for European fishermen by 25% over the period of 5.5 years. This was a period of predictability that Ursula von der Leyen was referring to, after which both sides will have to meet again every year to decide the future quota share in perpetuity. In case the UK doesn't agree new quotas with the EU, it could lead to raising the tariffs on the British fish export to the EU. And considering that half of the British catches is sold to EU countries, this would be a big problem for the UK. And so this total control gained with this deal is still strictly tied to the EU's approval. And even the agreement has been signed, there already have been some problems with it, like French fishermen that are struggling to obtain newly required fishing licenses due to administrative delays. And in addition, some new conditions were published for the specific area of Island of Jersey only 2 hours before they would have to be enforced. And so that infuriated hundreds of French fishermen who, in protest, blocked the Saint-Hélier port with their boats. Then French government accused those conditions to be in breach of the TCA and not legitimate. Both Paris and London sent military ships to monitor the situation, and the tension really reached its peak when the French Minister for Maritime Affairs threatened to cut off the island's electricity. But the situation has come down for now, and we are awaiting a dialogue in good faith, or if that doesn't resolve the dispute, for the possible court arbitration. The other issue holding back the negotiations from the beginning of Brexit process was the question of the Irish border, as I mentioned before. It's hard enough to imagine an efficient border checks on the main road where in less than 50 kilometers of journey, you are bound to cross the border at least 5 times each way, not to mention constant crossing by local communities to simply carry out their everyday activities. And like in some other parts of the Northern Ireland, like in the example of Lake Lough Ross, there are no existing documents marking the exact line where the border should be crossing through the lake, which provided in past an unregulated gray area of no one's land for the smugglers, for example. Luckily, now we have Google Maps that resolved the problem and designed the border for us. But from the more serious point of view, the difficulty in resolving the Irish border problem lies in the historic conflict called the Troubles, and that was officially ended with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998, when Good Friday Agreement removed previous checkpoints between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and prevented from any kind of physical structures to ever replace them. But as a result of Brexit referendum, the English decision was imposed over a very specific territory, in this case, that in 56% did not want any form of Brexit to happen in the first place. And so to avoid any hard border between two Irelands that would contradict the Good Friday Agreement, the Northern Ireland Protocol was applied, by which the territory of Northern Ireland will remain under both UK's and EU's regulations, such as the single market, customs union, and VAT regime. And so basically, this means there is no need for any checks for goods traveling from the Northern Ireland, neither to EU nor to the UK, but there must be controls on goods traveling from the UK to the Northern Ireland. And the necessity of any form of controls has broken a very delicate balance of peace between the two communities who still live in separate districts divided by tall peace walls. And in particular, during this year's Easter weekend, a bus was set on fire, and small groups of loyalists have attacked the police in different quarters of Belfast, injuring in total 32 police officers by throwing petrol bombs and bricks at them. And due to very short notice that didn't permit immediate implementation of the TCA's measures, a couple of concessions have been made, like granting grace periods to some products or checks necessary, for example, for sanitary and phytosanitary checks. They were delayed until April, and for chilled meats, that grace periods ended in June this year. Unfortunately, those periods were not enough, and as some of them started to expire, Michael Gove asked the EU to extend all of them until 2023, which EU did not accept. And then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland announced he will extend all of the grace periods anyway until 1st October 2021. This could lead to legal case against the UK that has already received a letter of formal notice from the EU Commission, and that could end up in financial penalties set by the European Court of Justice, or in the worst case scenario, impose the on the UK trade goods. In the beginning of this month, UK's chief negotiator David Frost admitted that the British government has underestimated the impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol on the local communities for which he blamed the EU's legal framework that didn't allow much flexibility for creative interpretation of the protocol. And until it came to the actual disturbances at the streets of Belfast, the government was dismissing any concerns about the Irish border as the Project Fear, the same way some world leaders initially were dismissing the threat of the COVID-19, but then got corrected by the reality. Mr. Frost admitted there is no infrastructure or personnel to perform necessary amount of checks at the end of all the grace periods, and instead of considering the use, instead of providing them, he is considering the use of courts and politics to avoid those obligations. And so in conclusion, this trade and cooperation agreement was supposed to bring predictability and certainty for the businesses on the both sides. As we all know, uncertainty in business is a risk, and a risk is a cost that should be avoided if possible, especially in the time of a global pandemic like now. And since the implementation of the agreement, we have already seen a series of political, legal, and regulatory retaliations between the UK and the EU against each other, and even every unnecessary threat of legal actions imposing the tariffs or other restrictions from one moment to another does not provide for very stable grounds to operate for the future. And even the TCA has been put in place and ratified by both sides. It seems like them really trust the other party or don't intend to fully implement and respect its conditions. And this clarifies kind of why the Brexit is often referred to as a divorce. So really the end of the Brexit process is far from over, and we will have to wait and see how it will evolve, most probably in court. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.